Okay, good evening and welcome to this Saturday night event in the Lockdown 2 Festival. And I am delighted to be able to introduce two giants of the crime fiction world and two writers who really inspired me and kind of influenced me in my own journey into crime writing, Ian Rankin and John Connolly. I've been asked just to mention that all the books the most recent books by all three of us are available in Waterstones with a 30% discount. And that hopefully, I think Luca has put that in the chat as well. If anyone has any questions along the way, I will be asking Ian and John questions probably for about 40 minutes or so. And then if there are questions that we haven't covered that you would like to put in the Q&A, I'll be very happy to put them to the two gents. For now, though, it is an absolute honor to be joined by Ian and John. Ian is a multi-million copy best-selling author of over 30 novels and the creator of John Rebus. His most recent novel is A Song for the Dark Times. John Connolly has likewise written or edited over 30 books and is possibly best known as the creator of the Charlie Parker series of novels, the most recent of which was The Dirty South. Both of those titles are available through Waterstones. And welcome, gentlemen, to you both. Thanks very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having us, Brian.
Cheers, Brian.
What we're going to do this evening, just for the benefit of the audience, most of the questions that I'm going to ask will be to both gents, and I'm just going to sit back then and relax and enjoy the evening while the two of them hopefully talk for an hour. So I've only actually got about two questions. The first of the questions, though, is going to focus very much on the idea of writing a series. Ian now is 23 books into the Rebus series. John is 18 or 19, counting his novella into the Parker series. And one of the things that I wondered is, do you find the familiarity of the world that you've created for these characters to be a comfort or to be a restraint? And maybe, Ian, we'll start with you on that one, if you don't mind.
Well, when I began the Rebus books, it was with the intention of only writing one book with this guy. And I went away and did other things. I did a spy novel and a thriller. And I drifted back to him because A, those books hadn't sold anything. And B, my editor of the time said, I quite liked that guy, Rebus, whatever happened to him. And I knew I wanted to write about contemporary Edinburgh. I knew I wanted to write about Scotland. I wanted to write about issues. I wanted to write kind of political books that would look at the problems we've got in society, urban society. I thought, well, a detective's a pretty good means of doing that, a pretty good way of looking at the world because he's got access to different layers of society. And I wanted to write about specifically Edinburgh. And I thought, well, he's a good way of exploring Edinburgh from top to bottom, the haves and the have-nots. So he kind of crept in as a series character. I didn't grow up reading. I'm one of the few crime writers I know. I don't know about John. I didn't read crime fiction when I was young. I came to it after the first Rebus novel was published, really. I mean, I'd read some. I'd read all the books that were made into X certificate films that I wasn't old enough to go and see at the cinema. So I had all the John Shaft books by Ernest Tideman, blaxploitation books, and I had various other things like The Godfather that I wasn't old enough to go and see at the cinema. But I didn't read, Miss Marple or anything like that until I was published. And when I was published and Noughts and Crosses went onto the crime shelf, I started reading crime fiction, and I found that a lot of the books I was reading were a part of a series. And I liked the strengths of that. I liked writing about the same person, watching them change, watching them age, and watching how the world around them changed. How can you write about the changing world if you've got a character who never changes? Now, having said that, I watched an event here yesterday on this festival, and it was about high concept thrillers. And I did ask the question on the chat function about, are there things you envy about people who write series? Because there are things that series writers envy about people who write standalones, obviously. But funnily enough, all the people who wrote high concept standalone thrillers were, all of them, I think, said they would like to write a series. John?
I think like a lot of writers, I was slightly surprised to find myself published. I think there are people who probably are still surprised to see me published. But at the time I was, I'd written this book and when it was accepted, I suddenly realized I had to live with what I'd done. And I had originally thought that I would end the book after 3 novels. I thought it would the series would end after The Killing Kind. I had an idea that I would end it, and I had, unlike Ian, I had read quite a lot of mystery fiction, particularly American writers, James Lee Burke, later Ross MacDonald. So I suppose, and I had actually done the first university course in Ireland on crime fiction. I'd done it in 1991, or the first option, at a time when really universities here, didn't think you should be teaching genre literature at all. It didn't think you should be teaching literature by anybody who wasn't safely dead for about 50 years. And I suppose I ended up thinking slightly differently about it. I came to it from a slightly different angle, I shouldn't say academic angle, but at least I'd read a lot of the secondary texts, and I'd read a lot of the primary texts. And so when I had the opportunity to write a series, I began to think about it. I hope I began to think about it in a slightly different way, which was that I knew what I didn't like about series novels. I didn't like the fact that so often the central character didn't appear to have a memory and had no recollection of things that had happened in previous books. And trauma was something, past traumas were hardly ever mentioned. In the James Bond series, when I think it was For Your Eyes Only, where you see Roger Moore at his wife's graveside, and you think, well, he hasn't mentioned her in years. How often was he going to the grave? And so when I began writing, I very much wanted Parker to have a memory. I knew he would age. I knew that the books would be very tied up with grief and survival and how we come to terms with loss and the damage it does to us. And that has kind of powered the series along. And so I think it's much more difficult for writers who write standalone series. One of the lovely things about writing a series is that if you're fortunate enough to create characters for which readers have affection, they will have a huge amount of loyalty to you, and they will return simply for the pleasure of spending time with these characters, where I think sometimes standalone writers often have to reinvent the wheel every time. And unfortunately, there's only so much reinvention the wheel has to offer. And you begin, even if you're writing standalone characters, you see those writers falling back on templates. They're not writing a series, but in effect, they kind of are to particular types of character. And whereas I feel I'm more comfortable writing about these characters who I've been with for a while, but who, a bit like Rebus, who are getting older. I began writing my first novel when I was 25, and I'm 52 now, 53 nearly. And the things I've gone through are very different. And the things I'm concerned about, whether it's my kids, whether it's my health, whether it's all the things that come with entering middle age, they've altered the books because I've put all those things onto Parker. I've been able to do that. And so I hope, a bit like the Rebus novels, they develop because you develop as a person. You're not the same writer that you were when you began. So for me, that offers a degree of comfort. And it's one of the reasons I enjoy writing those books, because I do get to explore the things that concern me now, I suppose.
I suppose, and again, this is a question to both of you. One of the things certainly that I found with writing the Devlin series was, in the first book, Devlin's son was 6 months. By the time I got to book 3 or book 4, Devlin had aged, but his child was still sitting on a rug eating Farley's Rust. And I kind of realized...
Can I say, Brian, you do something very interesting with the Devlin books, which is that he's content. Yeah. That you actually did something very, very difficult, because what I did when I started was that I gave this character all of this trauma that he then had to live with and go through. And for most of us, you can't live your life that way. You just deteriorate, you'd break down. And I think there's something lovely about the Devlin series, because he is a man who's trying to do his job. He has a family. He has that degree of, he's trying to stick with contentment. And I think contentment is something that's very hard. Normality and contentment are very hard to put across in fiction. And I don't think you always get the credit for that, because actually it's much easier to write characters who are traumatized, who are going through all of this suffering. It gives a different power to the books.
Well, thank you. No, but what I was going to say on that, sorry, blushing here at a distance. Thank you. What I was going to ask was, like, the challenge of keeping on top of that world as the world expands. And also one of the things with series, of course, is that once you make a decision about something that happens to a character, you're tied to it. And I kind of wondered to both of you, had you known when you started the book, and somebody has actually asked a very similar question here in the Q&A, had you known when you started that first book that it was going to be a series of such length, would there have been any early decisions that you would have taken differently, or were there any challenges that you met that possibly, had you known, you would have avoided? And Ian, if you want to take that one first.
Well, I would have made Rebus a lot younger in book one, so that I wouldn't then have to retire him 17 books later when he hit 60, which is was the mandatory retirement age for detectives in Scotland at that time. So yeah, I would have made him a little bit younger. The problem was that I thought he was only going to be around for one book, and I thought 40 was quite a good age for the detective to be world weary but able to chase suspects. Now he no longer can chase suspects, or he can't use his heft the way he used to in the early books. He's not a physical person. He's not a physical cop the way he was in the early books. He can't intimidate people the way he used to. He can't even climb stairs the way he used to. The new book starts with him having to buy a ground floor flat because he can no longer manage the stairs because he's got COPD. You know, that's a bonus as well as a problem. It's a bonus because when I sit down to write a new book, I can't get lazy. I can't get complacent. This guy's life has moved on. He's a different character. And so I've got to try and, it's almost like dealing with a new character when I come to start a new book. The world has moved on. He has moved on. He's not the person he was. So that's a challenge, but it's a good challenge to have, I think. And so yeah, I would have made him, I dare say I would have made him younger. He has got a lot of baggage in that first book. So yes, as you're suggesting, I've got to remember he's scared of flying because of what happened to him during his SAS training. He's got a brother who was a drug dealer. He's got this, that, and the other. His daughter was traumatized in book one. So when I come to write about her in the latest book, I've got to remember that 30, 40 years ago, she was traumatized, probably 30 years ago in her case. So yeah, all of that you've got to remember, because if you don't, fans will. But even I've never learnt this lesson. A few books ago, I gave Rebus a dog because I wrote a book called Even Dogs in the Wild, and I thought, well, if I'm going to call the book Even Dogs in the Wild, I better have a dog in it somewhere. So there's a stray dog, and I think, well, what happens to the stray dog? Oh, Rebus takes it home and then spends the rest of the book trying to offload it on people who refuse to take it off him. I started writing the next book, and 50 pages in, my wife said, how's the dog getting on? I went, oh, Christ. I'd completely forgotten that Rebus now had a dog to look after. So ever since then, never worked with children and animals, is what they say. And ever since then, whenever, like Rebus going up north in a new book to be with his daughter, something's got to happen to the dog. Does he take the dog with him? That's a real pain in the arse. So then he's got to have someone back in Edinburgh who's looking after the dog, and that interferes with the way they do their job. So yeah, I'm still making mistakes all these years later.
I had the dog issue as well. I think I ended up fobbing off a dog to his ex-girlfriend because you realize, well, if he goes away for a night, who's going to come around and let the dog out and feed it? All the
kill it, John. You can't
dog owners have to deal with. But it's interesting, because I've read Ian. I think Ian does something that we've all done, I think, which is that you excise things from the history that maybe don't suit what you're doing later. If I remember rightly, Rebus had an SAS background, didn't he, very early on? And it's quietly, because it doesn't fit with what happens later. But it's absolutely right. You excise the things that don't work so the series can continue. And I think readers are prepared to forgive an awful lot of that. I was very tied into, I had to go back to look at Every Dead Thing for the writing of The Dirty South. And its style, I realized, and its content was very beholden to a lot of the hard-boiled crime writing that I'd been reading. And so stylistically, if you were to read one of my later books and the earlier book, they bear no resemblance to each other. That feels like a very that one there, yeah. It feels like stylistically, it feels very much enthralled to its influences. And it took me, I don't know about Ian, obviously from what you've said, you're coming from a slightly different background. It took me an awfully long time to shake off those influences of the writers that I'd read and to hold on to the ones that were positive.
In some ways, we do come from a similar place, because I was studying literature at university when I started writing my books, and I was doing semiotics and deconstruction and stuff. And I saw the novel as a puzzle, as a game that was played between author and reader. And the crime novel, of course, is the ultimate example of that puzzle novel, which is why Umberto Eco wrote Name of the Rose rather than write anything else. And so in the early Rebus books, there are lots of games being played and lots of in-jokes and stuff. And when I, rereading this in preparation for tonight, almost, not every character, but lots of characters have the names of crime writers.
Yeah.
Cornell Woolrich. You've got an FBI agent called Woolrich. You've got somebody, Woolrich's wife has moved to La Jolla. La Jolla is where Raymond Chandler lived. I can't remember. Is there someone called Crace?
They were very deliberate nods to people that got me into terrible
trouble. It made me wonder. I mean, Parker. I mean, is it Robert B. Parker?
No, it was just having a placeholder name for a long time that I hadn't quite figured out. I mean, obviously, Rebus works for you precisely because of what you've been saying about puzzles. I hadn't been able to come up with a name. I think initially at one point when I began writing, he was Walker. I think he shared a name with a cricketer, and I thought that won't work. That'd be terrible. And eventually, I settled on Parker. There isn't. The things I regret now are things I couldn't have changed anyway because they were products of the writer I was at the time. And the mistakes I made were the mistakes of a young man. And now I make slightly different mistakes. There isn't much I would go back and change, I don't think. I think I have to live with a lot of the things I did.
I wonder if we were lucky in a way, John, that when we were being published, I mean, me more than you, because I was published before you, that the publishing industry at that time, if they liked you, even though if you weren't selling brilliantly, or they thought you might not sell brilliantly, if they liked you, they would keep you on and give you a chance. And so we were learning as we went, that each published book was a little step along the way of learning how to do this stuff. And I think these days you live and die very quickly in the publishing industry. If your first one or two books aren't big hits or medium-sized hits, then people, the publisher can tend to lose interest in you a bit.
Well, when my first book was being shopped around, because eventually there were 4 publishers who wanted to publish it, and it came down to 2, and one of them was Orion, and one of the reasons why I came very close to signing with them was because they had published you. And because they had given you one of the book I was given was The Hanging Garden had just come out. Was just about to come out when I was talking to them. And they gave me the hardback at The Hanging Garden. I think that we'll give you money on here. We'll throw in a book and a bag. There you go, I have an Ian Rankin book. I'll sign. But partly it was because they had given you the space and time to grow. And I was aware of how young I was, as you were when you began. And I wasn't very smart and I wasn't terribly mature, but I was smart enough to know that I was going to make a lot of mistakes and that I wanted to be with people who I felt would give me the space to make those mistakes and not punish me for them. And I think you're right. Now I suspect it's 3 books maybe. And then if you haven't got it by 3, there's a certain element of the clock running out and the patience running out. So I think we were fortunate, but I think I've been very lucky, and I think you probably say the same with the publisher I've ended up with. As I've gone on, they've tolerated experiments and they've tolerated things that haven't sold terribly well, but that helped make me a better writer. And I think they saw that as part of the development. A book like He was never going to sell as much as one of the Parker books. It simply wasn't. But that book changed the way that I write. It changed the style. It changed the way that I use dialogue. It changed the way of space in the novels. And so to be given that opportunity was very important to me. And did you have a book like that where you think that was a book that gave? Was it something like Black and Blue, or was it one of the non-series books that gave you that space perhaps you needed to develop?
Well, I've never written a book about Stan Laurel. I have to say. You were a question last night on the quiz. You were one of the questions. It was about, is it true that John Connolly has bought a plot that's going to where he wants to be buried that's right next to Stan Laurel's burial?
How did they find out?
I forget who you fooled, but you did fool one. One writer did go for that. They thought you would have bought the burial plot next to Stan Laurel. I don't know if you were. What was ridiculous? They said it only cost you $5,000. It cost at least $100,000 to get a plot next to Stan Laurel, surely. No, it was. I mean, I tried everything. I just wanted to be a full-time writer and I wanted to make a living from it. And having written one crime novel with Rebus, I went away and did a spy novel that I thought was going to be my Le Carre book, and that was Watchmen, and that refused to sell. Then I thought I'll write a big techno thriller, and that was West Wind, and that refused to sell. Came back to Rebus and did a few more with him, and he still wasn't selling terribly well. So I went off and wrote thrillers as Jack Harvey, and they weren't selling very well. And it was a very slow haul up this mountain. Until Black and Blue was, I often say was the breakthrough book. In a way, the previous books were an apprenticeship, and that book was in some ways it was a big thematic book because it needed to be, because I was desperate, because if it didn't succeed, I thought I was going to be dropped. And so The Hanging Garden was the first one, that one having won the Gold Dagger. The Hanging Garden, the next book afterwards, Orion got behind in terms of marketing and cover, the way the cover looked, it didn't look like a cliched typical crime novel at the time. And that was, and I was so happy to be with Orion because they had Larry Block. I was a huge Lawrence Block fan. And obviously they had James Lee Burke, and so they had a lot of and they had Michael Connolly. They had, a lot of my favorite American crime writers were published by Orion. So I was very happy to be on that list.
You see, if I can kind of think now, I mean, we talked quite a bit about where you came from. In terms of where you're going to with the series, one of the things that kind of struck me with both your most recent books, well, two different things, which are going to lead to two different questions, I suppose. The first was that in both books, the characters have been kind of taken out of the world that they have been in most recently. So Ian, with you, Rebus leaves Edinburgh. And John, you've gone right back almost to before Every Dead Thing, or certainly right back to the very, very start of Parker's story. The other thing that struck me about both books was the importance of the supporting characters, particularly with Rebus. Now, Siobhan has always been important, but the alternating almost between the plot with Rebus and the plot with Siobhan and Malcolm. And John, I know your next book, The Nameless Ones, Lewis and Angel, or Lewis particularly, I think is a very significant character there. Have you found, as you've been writing the series, that those kind of supporting characters are becoming more and more important? Are they kind of pointing a way that you want to develop the series moving forward? Somebody has asked here in the questions, Ian, if Siobhan will become the main character at some point further down the line. So whichever you want to take either of those questions first.
Well, I want to hear John talk about Lewis and Angel.
Yeah. When I began, they were effectively a form of light relief in what would be a very dark book, but they were also a way of showing a side to Parker that was, he wasn't a very likable character. He wasn't a man that you could really empathize with or get close to, and it was very hard to see why people would want to be around him. And it was only in the company of those two people that you saw something that was likable, that was admirable, that it was a sense of kind of self-awareness to him. And gradually, as the books went on, they became much more important to the theme of the books, because they represented, at one point he's faced with a choice. He is faced with the possibility of domesticity. He can settle down. His girlfriend is having a child. He can be with her. He can start again. But he is this man who has all of this rage and grief. And they represent an outlet for that. They are that part of him. They're the id, essentially. And he's at one point he's offered a choice. I think it's in The Black Angel, where he ends up in Prague with them, and he has to call his girlfriend and say, well, I'm in Prague. And she goes, well, an angel. And she says, I always thought we'd have gone to Prague together. And well, there was a joke to it. There was a real edge of grief as well, because she realizes that he has chosen these people. It's because he's frightened. I think he's scared that something might happen to this child again. And if she's near him, the likelihood of that is greater. And so they become to represent this a certain direction that he has taken. And they in turn realize that, as one of them says, I think Angel says that they've condemned themselves. Essentially, they've damned themselves by standing alongside with him. They're probably going to die because they've allied themselves to him. And they don't mind that. They've decided that is not, if that's the end that's going to be for them, that's not a bad end. So they've become more interesting and more complex. I still think they work better in the context of the Parker novels than they do alone. And The Nameless Ones is a way of trying to find a middle path with that.
And Ian, what with Siobhan and Malcolm Fox? I mean, obviously Fox had books of his own, but the two of them, they almost share equal kind of page space, if you like, in this book with Rebus.
Yeah, I mean, there's never been a plan, Brian. I mean, people thought when I retired Rebus the first time round, oh, well, like, you've got Siobhan Clarke in your back pocket ready to take over, and I really didn't. I thought I was done. And I started writing standalones because of that. And then along came Malcolm Fox, and I thought, okay, I'll hang on to you for a wee while. You're quite an interesting person. And then when I brought Rebus back, I thought, well, almost like this id and ego thing. If you've got Rebus wanting to rejoin the police, you've got Malcolm Fox not wanting him to rejoin the police because he's the kind of bad old-fashioned cop the police no longer need or require. And Fox just stuck around because he was useful. Siobhan became my voice. She was away saying to Rebus, you know, look, there's another way of looking at this. There's another way of looking at the world. Your way of looking at the world isn't necessarily the right way of looking at the world or the only way of looking at the world. So there's quite a lot of me in Siobhan and in Malcolm Fox, more so probably than there is in Rebus. So possibly they could take over, possibly, I don't know. I mean, people have said to me, maybe you can do an endeavour and go back in time and write about the early adventures, or you could concentrate on Cafferty, who I guess is the bad guy who sometimes does Rebus a favour, although more often than not, you think he might end up destroying Rebus rather than saving him. Never quite sure how that relationship is going to go. But he could maybe carry a book. I honestly don't know. I mean, I hope I've got one more book left in me. That's all I ever, you know, if the good Lord spares me and there's one more book, it could be any of these or none.
Ian, can I ask, when you went back to Rebus after that break, did you conceive of him in a different way? Had the break caused you to look at him in a different way, or had your approach to how you dealt with the character changed?
I think so, John, because I knew that he was retired and he was going to be working in this cold case unit as a civilian with a bunch of other ex-cops. And it was a real unit that existed in Edinburgh at that time. There were 4 people in it, 1 serving officer and 3 retired. And they just went through old cases and just dusted them off and looked at if there could be any chance of reopening them properly using new technology or whatever was available to them. So he thought the police were behind him, and yeah, he'd lived a few more years, and the health issues were coming along. Fairly soon after that, I gave him the COPD, emphysema, as we used to call it. I quite liked that because it's got the word cop in it. And you know, I wanted to give him. He's in his 60s. He's in his 60s. He's been smoking and drinking his whole life and eating nothing but corned beef rolls. Surely something's got to give. And
did you have any reservations about coming back to him?
I did. I mean, when I sat down to write the first page of the Standing in Another Man's Grave, I didn't know if the voice would still be there. It was a scene at a funeral at the graveside, and Rebus is standing away off. He doesn't want to be part of the retinue. He's going to be standing off near the trees. And then just his voice, he goes, Christ, I'd die for a cigarette. I could kill for a cigarette right now. And I thought, oh yeah, you're back. You never really went away. You just sat in a wee locked cell in my head. And when I turned that key, you came out rejoicing. You were so happy to be back. And that was a buzz for me because I wasn't sure if he had left the building or not. And he really hadn't. He was just very keen to be back amongst us, but in a different way, a different person. Not the young, youthful, full of vim and vigor Rebus of the past, but a guy who's very aware of his own mortality and also asking a very big question that we all end up asking eventually: do I still make a difference in the world? Do I still have a role to play? I mean, he is meant to have, you know, pushed off. And in the new book, when he goes up to the north of Scotland, the cops up there have no time for him whatsoever. He's just an encumbrance. Just because he's an ex-cop doesn't mean to say they're going to give him any help at all. As far as they're concerned, he's just getting in the way or trying to protect his daughter, even if she might have done something terrible. So yeah, that's all interesting, and that gave me a new set of challenges. And as I've said, I quite like that. I quite like the fact that he has all these new challenges, that he isn't the guy he was. He is very aware of his own mortality. And whenever he gets together with Cafferty, the gangster, the two of them are sort of staring at each other as the last 2 dinosaurs left on Earth as the meteorite is coming towards them.
John, if you don't mind me asking, Ian there has said that of the characters, Siobhan and Malcolm possibly are more in common with him than Rebus is. And I mean, certainly I would kind of argue my own books, Devlin is probably much closer to me than any of the other characters are. in your books, which of the characters would you say is most like you? And I mean, I'm going to go back to a phrase I once heard Ian use about Rebus, which was that he is his psychiatrist and punchbag. And to both of you, do you find that your main character is your psychiatrist and punchbag? So, John, if I can ask you that first.
I mean, I've never had Parker. He shares all my tastes. I've never had him say anything that I wouldn't say or that I disagreed with. And that includes politically or socially as much as anything else. I put a lot of my own, the little part of me that's there was a very famous interview with, I think, with Anthony Hopkins, who was asked, how do you play somebody, how do you create somebody like Hannibal Lecter? And he says you find a little part of yourself that's angry, that's filled with rage, that just wants to turn on people, and you expand it into a performance. And I suppose the little part of me that deals with rage and grief and anger is Parker. And a lot of that is in him. But there's probably much more of me in somebody like Angel is much closer to my voice, I suppose, than Parker would be. And yet I would miss writing about Parker much more than I would miss writing about Angel. I get to look at the world in a very different way through his eyes. And that's why I've never yet grown tired of writing those books. Whenever I've gone to them, it's like putting on an overcoat that's kind of comfortable. You put it on and it fits perfectly, and you know where everything is, and your keys are, and the rips in the pockets, and the part of it's that really you've never got around, the thing on the shoulder that's never quite worked. All of those things. So, but I do also realize that with that comfort, and I think I might have this in common. You can go a little bit too comfortable with it, with that notion of simply slotting into the series of the character. Much every second book or so to write something different, in part in order to learn a new skill that I can apply to the Parker books, but also to ensure that I never get too comfortable with it. And the Dirty South was a version of that. The Dirty South was what happens if I put aside all of the things that offer that comfort. If I take away the supernatural elements that people like, if I take away Angel and Louis, if I take away all the things that make him likable, that have accrued over the years, if I set all of them aside and then use this quite arch Southern Gothic writing style, rather than the slightly more pared back style that's come in the earlier books, what kind of book will emerge from that? And it's always a way of testing. It's a way of trying to develop a new muscle and to not get too comfortable in the series. Because I feel the moment I do that, I think readers have a very good ear and a very good eye. And I think they spot those moments when they think a writer is coasting. Yeah. And I've always been very conscious of trying not to do that, even at the risk of aggravating them, because, I think it was Otto Penzler who said to me, that you made two mistakes in your career. The first was all the supernatural elements. He said they shouldn't be there. And the second thing is that you should just have written the Parker books. You should have done them year in, year out, because every time you go off and do something else, you lose a few readers and they don't come back. But in the end, as with most things in life, you find the compromise that allows you to be the person you want to be, and in my case, the writer that I want to be. And that involves doing those other things, and occasionally maybe making your publishers wince slightly or your readers get a bit frustrated. But in the end, you improve. It's all part of this effort to get a little bit better, I think.
And Ian, can I ask you that comment about Rebus being a psychiatrist and punchbag, does that still apply since he's come back out of retirement, or do you think some of the other characters now are more your way for exploring your kind of concerns and your thoughts?
No, I think it's still mostly Rebus. He's just a few years older than me, so the stuff he's going through, I've got coming to me. Like him, I ache in the places where I used to play. I'm not quite as far along as him. I've not got the emphysema. I can still manage a flight of stairs. And since the pub shut last year, I'm certainly a lot healthier than I was, or not, as the case may be. Maybe I'm drinking more in private. But no, it's always been a way of just dealing with he looks at all writers, all writing is an act of detection, and all writers are detectives in a way. We're all looking at the world in bewilderment, trying to make sense of it, trying to make sense of life, trying to answer very big questions about morality and philosophy and the way the world is, and do we have any impact on it? Are we passive or are we active? Rebus allows me to do that. Rebus is much more of a rule breaker than I am. He takes more risks than I do. He's more physical than I am. He gets into situations of danger where I would shy away from it. So he gets to be my Mr. Hyde a lot of the time. And in these books, there's usually a Dr. Jekyll figure and a Mr. Hyde figure, because a lot of Scottish crime fiction does come back to this the notion that the human being can contain good and evil within the same body, or the potential for good and evil can be contained in the same person, and those two sides of that person can be at war with each other. And crime fiction is very good for allowing you to explore that. Crime fiction at its heart is about why we human beings continue to do terrible things. What drives us to do these terrible things? And it's a very easy question to ask and an almost impossible question to answer. But Rebus allows me to explore all of that, and it is very cathartic. It does save me a fortune in psychiatrists or psychoanalysts' bills. And any shit that's happening in my personal life, I can just channel to him, and ask him to go through it on my behalf, or ask him to explore it on my behalf, and hopefully maybe not have all the answers at the end of the process, but maybe have one or two inklings as to where the answers lie.
I know Jenny often says to me that she'll read a book, and if there's an argument that we've had that she's won, in the book it will be completely turned around in the course of it. And Parker or somebody else will have pointed out that actually that's not what that word means at all. Whatever, something really stupid. So she gets quite aggravated with that over a period of time. Is that it's like my esprit d'escalier. I get to suddenly I get to go, yeah, I know exactly what I should have said to her that time we had that argument in the kitchen. And there it goes. So in a way, yeah. It's therapeutic for me, not so much for her, I think. It's
funny, because rereading your first book, John, just for this, to try and refresh my memory where it all began, it then led me to this book, which you co-edited.
Which you contributed to, thankfully.
You and Declan Burke approached lots and lots of crime writers and said, write about your favourite or write about one of the great crime novels. And it's an extraordinary book. I don't know how many people watching us tonight know about it, but there's so many great essays in there, including one by Brian. I won't say who he's writing about. And you wrote about Michael Connolly. You wrote about Michael Connolly's first novel. And I wrote about Derek Raymond's I Was Dora Suarez. And when I was rereading your first book, there's a Gothic. There's a Grand Guignol Gothic in that book that I think is part of a grand tradition in horror / crime fiction. Well, yeah. And I just wondered if that was an influence on you. The Gothic was an influence.
Huge. I was, Brian will know this, not many. I've just submitted one of the things I did during lockdown, which I had in mind for a long time, was to write a kind of history of genre fiction in Ireland. Through stories. So it has stories, about 60, 70 stories, but actually, and often the introductions are longer than the stories. It's an attempt to trace the history. And of course, you mentioned Stevenson, but an awful lot of the early mystery writers, they came out of the Gothic tradition. A lot of them they were writing, someone like L.T. Mead, who was an Irish writer, was writing detective stories alongside Gothic thrillers, alongside pieces of supernatural fiction. Sheridan Le Fanu wrote detective stories and supernatural stories. So at the beginning, the same writers were kind of experimenting. They were trying to find a way of writing these stories. So I think there's always been a very Gothic thread to it, particularly, and I think perhaps the writers from this side of the Atlantic are much more conscious of it, because so much of that tradition grew up here. It came out of Irish writers, it came out of fantastic Scottish and British writers. And so I think English writers, and if you're on this side of the Atlantic, whether you're conscious of it or not, I think you're absorbing a lot of those influences, because they were in the writers that influenced you in turn, and we're all part of this continuum. So for me, I never, to go back to what Ola Penza was saying, I never saw a particular tension between those Gothic and supernatural influences in the books and the concept of mystery fiction, because in the beginning, I thought it was something much more interesting. And these rules that we have are products of the 1920s and 1930s. That's the point at which we begin setting out and saying, well, this is what a detective novel is, and this is what is appropriate in it, and this is what is not appropriate. And like most writers, I have a deep distrust of anybody who sets out a set of rules for writing. God love him, even Elmore Leonard's set of rules for writing were great if you wanted to write like Elmore Leonard, but not much good if you wanted to write like anybody else.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's an interesting discussion, I think, and I can see it in your books, because I think you in particular are so conscious of Stevenson, that even though Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is set in London, it's Edinburgh.
Oh, it is.
It's not London that anybody would conceive of. It should be Edinburgh. So, do you feel that it's filtered into your work too? Because you live in a Gothic city.
Yeah. Yes, and also the most haunted city in Britain, we like to say. And the Scots imagination and the literature, as with Ireland, it's steeped in the supernatural, it's steeped in ghost stories, it's steeped in a belief that there's another world that we just can't see. It's just slightly there if we scratch the surface. And again, that's what crime fiction does. It scratches the surface of an apparently reasonable, rational society and says all this dark stuff is happening just below here if you care to look. Now, of course, most of us live quite well not looking because when you stare into the abyss stares back at you. But in the Gothic, and a lot of Scots crime writers, I'll tell you, they're influenced by not just Stevenson, Jekyll and Hyde, but they're influenced by Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which was also an influence on Stevenson. And there is a continuum there from Confessions of a Justified Sinner, the first serial killer novel, as I often say in introductions and things, or one of the first, through Jekyll and Hyde to Miss Jean Brodie, who is both good and evil contained in the same person. The potential is there. And Brodie, she tells us, is descended from Deacon William Brodie, who was the template for Jekyll and Hyde. He was an Edinburgh guy. He was a deacon of rights. He was a carpenter. He was a member of society, but he also had a gang who would break into your house and hit you over the head and steal your valuables. And he was hanged on a scaffold that he had built. And so, that was a real guy, Brodie, who then became Miss Jean Brodie. And Stevenson had a wardrobe in his bedroom as a kid that had been made by William Brodie. So it all connects. Now, I did my PhD on Muriel Spark, and while doing my PhD on Muriel Spark in Edinburgh, got the idea for Rebus. And that first Rebus novel was very Gothic and very dark, and steeped in Stevenson, steeped in all this stuff. And it's very hard to let go. It is a very scary, it's a scary location. But you chose to set your books not in Ireland, young man, but in the Gothic South, in the American South, which also is a place where the supernatural is allowed free reign.
Yeah, and that might have been, I suspect that was part of the attraction for me. One of the difficulties, when I've been writing this little history, and I think I've brought it up in essays and introductions before, one of the problems with being a genre writer in Ireland at the end of the 20th century was that there weren't really that many models to follow. When you and people like Val on that side of the Atlantic, and over on the other side a little bit later, Michael Connolly and George Pelicanos were coming through, this wonderful new flowering of extraordinary talent in genre fiction just across the water from us. We had none of it, because almost throughout the 20th century, genre writing in Ireland had effectively died. And anybody who had any ambitions to do it went abroad and set novels in England, by and large. And so when I began wanting to write, I looked around and there were no models for what I wanted to do. That whole continuum had been lost for us. And it was lost for very particular reasons, because at the end of the 19th century, our future president said we should have no shilling shockers and penny dreadfuls, he said. He declared war on genre fiction because that was English. That was the other. And we had to, as a new country, we had to decide what kind of literature we were going to write. And it became very prescriptive. You could write about the land and about Catholicism. There were writers who set this down in print. The land Catholicism, and writers who went abroad were effectively class traders. They were not involved in the building of this country. And so for most of the 20th century, there is very little genre fiction of note produced in Ireland. And so when I started out, I was reacting against those rules, which were still to some degree in place. What was appropriate for an Irish writer to write? And it was a way of escaping all of that stuff. And yet, wherever you go, there you are. I brought all of these influences with me, all of these, this fascination with ghost stories that, like you, I had since childhood. That was what I read. That was the first literature I can recall reading, and it's always stayed with me. And I guess, as you pointed out, there was a point of connection with that Southern Gothic tradition. That was a landscape that allowed for it. And I think it's why I like James Lee Burke so much, because he was the only American author who was really trying to do that, who was really engaging with that concept of the Gothic. And it may be because he was so conscious of his own Irish roots. You know, he came from Waterford. That's where his family come from. And yes, he was looking to writers like Faulkner as well. But, you know, he was a Catholic. He's a deeply Catholic writer. He had that comfort that you're talking about, that comfort with the anti-rational. And that's very much a product, I think, of a tradition from this side of the Atlantic, not necessarily from that, if you want to call it a Protestant American tradition, perhaps.
I think one of the things, I mean, certainly speaking personally, two books that really influenced me as a writer. The first of them, 1997, I picked up Black and Blue in the Wallabies in Belfast. It's on the shelf still behind me there. Unfortunately, I picked up a trade paperback instead of a hardback, and I really am kicking myself now. The other one then, of course, 1999 was Every Dead Thing. And those two things, certainly, I mean, as a writer from Northern Ireland, and I mean, John, you said there about that genre fiction didn't really exist in Ireland during that period. Northern Ireland, I think, even more so. A lot of the crime fiction that was been written by outsiders, or else someone like Colin Bateman, who was writing kind of satire, or Eugene McEldowney or Owen McNamee. And it was really, I suppose, post the Good Friday Agreement that kind of writers like myself thought, right, why can't we use the local row, as Patrick Cavanagh said? And I think something, and one of the reasons why at the start of this I said about the influence of both of you, I think, Ian, you showed that it was possible to write State of the Nation novels set in your hometown. And John, you showed that it was possible for an Irish writer to write superb crime fiction and to succeed in it. Do you feel that kind of, I mean, surely now you must have a sense of being able to look at all that generation of writers that you have inspired or influenced and kind of feel, yeah, that was, I was there at the start and that was a good place to be?
No, I'm just terrified. They're all getting better than me. And there are so many of them. I wish you would just all go away. You know, it's a very crowded field now. And, you know, everybody's nipping, if not at your heels, at your knees, and if not at your knees, at places further up the body. No, it's great. I mean, I do think we've got this fantastic, not just camaraderie. I think, you know, we're all coming from the same place, as it were. We're all writing about this subject because it interests us, and it interests us for various reasons. But at heart, we've all got the same aim, which is to write good books that will deal with complex moral situations, but in an exciting way that isn't prescriptive. We're not tub thumping. We're not standing up at Speaker's Corner and saying this is the way the world is. You know, we all want to be Seamus Heaney, not Ian Paisley. And you know, we may never succeed, but yeah, I think it's I mean, you know, of course I'm going to say it's a golden age for crime writing. I mean, I do think it is, and I do think, especially in Ireland, I think the cessation, in inverted commas, of the Troubles led to a flowering of Northern Irish crime writing that was explaining what just happened. During times of great conflict, you tend not to need the crime fiction. You need the crime fiction afterwards to explain what just happened and why. And I think that's what Irish crime fiction, your own included, by the way, Brian, with The Last Crossing especially, which I love to bits, is just trying to explain to a readership, look, this is the hell we've just gone through, and this is kind of why it happened, and let's hope it doesn't happen again. And maybe if we all read books and become more empathetic, it might not happen again.
It's interesting that, you know, two very different models have emerged on this very small island that we have. As you say, so much of the crime writing that's come out of Northern Ireland does have the shadow of the Troubles across it. It can but have it. It can't come out of that awareness of it. And yet down south, it's become very much female psychological crime writing.
Yeah,
seems to be the model that's emerging. An awful lot of the male writers who are writing about Ireland, or trying to set novels in Ireland, have fallen by the wayside or really struggled. And one of the reasons I wondered why that was, and one of the reasons I think in part is that a lot of us are the children of Maeve Binchy, because Maeve Binchy is the first popular fiction author in Ireland who actually managed to be commercially successful outside Ireland. And it causes publishers to look at Ireland in a different way. Up until then, I think a lot of us were more admired than read. And certainly we're not selling in quantities. Irish writers were really, really struggling. And suddenly British publishers and American publishers looked at Irish writers and thought, well, maybe there are more Maeve Binchys out there. And a whole generation of writers emerged who are female, writing contemporary women's fiction, often of a really high standard. And we created this kind of female readership, female genre readership. And that naturally transferred to crime fiction, I think.
Who published Maeve Binchy?
Orion.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were great. They were right there from the beginning. They knew what they were doing. So, yeah, and I think maybe
that's some good Orion publishing nights with Maeve.
Did she? She was a great. I mean, she has a reputation of being everybody's mum or auntie. She could be hard as nails. Oh, yeah. You wouldn't want to cross her, and that was what was lovely about her. But also, she was one of the things I loved. Was really lovely about her was that when that generation of female writers were coming up, she insisted that they get together. She often invited them around to her house for dinners and lunches. She didn't want them at each other's throats. Because she realized that there would be enough. It was a very male dominated. Irish fiction was very male dominated. And a snobbery was prevalent in it. And she knew that they would have trouble. She knew that they would have problems. And she didn't want them to have problems among themselves. There would be enough people sniping at them from the outside. So she cultivated that. She was very careful about that. And I think that was extraordinarily farsighted of her.
I remember the last time I did an event in Dunleary, just outside Dublin. I think it was a Dunleary Book Festival. And Marion Keyes came along to sit in the audience and watch, and that was just so lovely. Partly because I got to have dinner with her and her husband beforehand. But there's that, yeah, as you say, there's that lovely, it's just you know what, it's commercial fiction, isn't it? It's that camaraderie of people who are not taken seriously by the literary establishment. And we go, well, look, we're great storytellers. And we might, you know, we admire each other for the fact that we keep doing this stuff, and we keep selling.
I think that there's also a case that crime readers don't read one book a year. It's not a competition. We're not all fighting over that one sale, because a rising tide floats every boat. The more people that read crime fiction, the more people read a lot of crime fiction. I'm going to ask, I'm aware that time is kind of pressing on us. We have quite a few question and answers on the questions in the Q&A. I had one other question that I did want to ask both of you, and this is kind of a personal one for me, I suppose. Whenever I'm starting a book, I need a tuning fork. I need a song or a piece of music that sets the tone for the book. Most obviously, Hurt was Family Life by the Blue Nile. And I know you're both fans of the Blue Nile. So do you listen to music when you're writing? And do you use music to set the tone of the book that you're writing? I know both of you, I mean, I know you provide playlists for the music that you've listened to, but it's that tuning fork idea. And it was Seamus Heaney, actually, to go back to Heaney. Heaney was the one who first talked about needing a tuning fork when he was starting a play. When he started The Curate Troy, he needed a tuning fork moment to get the rhythm and the tone of the piece. Do you need a tuning fork for the start of a book, or do you just launch into it?
I think, I mean, it's not quite a tuning fork, but in this last book, for example, I decided early on that Rebus, as he drove north, would only have one CD in the car with him, and it'd be a CD that had been burnt by Siobhan, and it would be a mix of songs he knew and songs he didn't know. And those songs would somehow reflect on where the world was, or where Rebus's life was at the time. And that was quite fun to decide what songs she would have thought he should be listening to. There's a Brexit song in there, for example, which is a song by The Good, the Bad and the Queen. And he doesn't know who The Good, the Bad and the Queen are, but it's a song that, listen to the lyrics, he thinks it's a song about Brexit. So it's probably off their second album, Merry England. And so that was quite fun to put that together. And I know John's done it, he's done CDs of the music in the books.
Yeah, I don't listen to music while I write. And it's become maybe less important to me as time has gone on in the books. It's not referenced quite as much. For me, no, it's not usually music. Sometimes it'll be a little piece of history. I think you're right about the concept of it. I think there is a little spark for every book. There is a little something that provides a through line, perhaps, but not usually music for me. But it can be sometimes just a line of a poem. I mean, I tend to use lines from poetry or books that I've been reading, I'll find a quote, and a book will hang sometimes on a quote from somebody else. Sometimes I'll just have come across 2 lines in something and I'll think, actually, that encapsulates everything that I'm trying to do in the book, which is quite frustrating because I'm going to spend 420 pages doing something that someone has done in a rhyming couplet. But, you live with these things. So for me, actually, it's often a piece of literature that somebody else has written that gives me that tuning fork moment, if you want.
And that kind of reminds me that for me, often to get the title of the book, it is a song lyric. There's a line in a song that just to me is the theme of the book. And this time around it wasn't. It was a line from Brecht. In the dark times, will there be songs? Yes, there will be songs about the dark times. And I thought 2019, when I started writing the book, we were living through some pretty dark times. What did I know?
Well, that leads me on actually to the next question. I'm just going to run through some of the Q&A here, and if you don't mind keeping the answers as brief as possible to see if we can cover as many of them as possible. Given that Rebus and Parker are both aging in real time, will your series react to or include the events of 2020, 2021, or will you just skip past them or kind of set before them? I found out with Blood Ties, just to answer that, Blood Ties is set in the week before lockdown in 2020, partly because it created that sense of an inevitability. The reader would know what was coming. And the book is very much the opening page kind of sets up how the story ends for Devlin's father. So that was a very deliberate choice. But I was wondering for both of you, will you use the pandemic? I mean, Ian, I know that Song for the Dark Times was edited during the pandemic, and certainly there is a darkness there.
Yeah, but it wasn't. I didn't have to take it on board at all, and I'm not sure I would write about the pandemic. I thought cynically, nobody's going to want to read about the pandemic. We're going to want to escape from it when we come out of this. But in fact, I've read 2 really good novels set about pandemics or during pandemics recently. And so, I think the books are out. The books are going to be there. And if they're well written, there will be a readership for them.
I've got the book next year is actually going to be 2 short novels, which I think could have been published separately, but makes more sense to put the 2 of them together. And the second one is set on March 6th, over one day, on March 16th, 2020, as Portland was facing the possibility of some form of lockdown, and that panic set in. I wanted to set something that was very contained over a 24-hour period. And that seemed to provide the opportunity, and also an opportunity perhaps to move the novels on a couple of years, because I haven't aged them year by year. And so that will maybe move us towards what will be, I think, the final phase of the series. It will allow me to do that.
And I suppose I'm going to ask this question without obviously looking for spoilers, but do both of you have an idea of where the respective series will end? Or is it a case, I mean, Ian, you said earlier that it's, by the grace of God, 1 book more. But do you have a kind of an end point in sight? We're not asking you when it will be, but just do you know how the story will end for you two?
I mean, I get asked this a lot, and I always say, I think the next book might be the last, and then people go, no, the next book's going to be the last. And I go, I don't know. I mean, if I've got 1 book left in me, and if there's more for Rebus to do, then I'll keep going with them as long as I possibly can. But I would guess there's got to be an end point. I mean, there has to be an end point with a character who's the age he is in with the health situation he's got. But the book I've got coming out in September is me finishing Willie McIlvaney's unfinished first Laidlaw novel, or a kind of Laidlaw novel that's a prequel. I've got an idea for a book after that, which is a standalone that I've not started yet. So it's going to be the year after next before I start to think about if there's 1 more Rebus left in the tank.
I keep thinking, I've known for quite a long time what the final chapter I would write would be.
Ooh.
And I keep thinking, that maybe I should write it and stick it in an envelope and say to Jenny, look, if a safe lands on my head, just stick that at the end of whatever I've been working on. So I've known how I wanted to provide a kind of conclusion to what I wanted to do for quite a while. But I don't want to do it because actually I still enjoy writing these books, and I still think I have more to say through these characters. So it's not something that I'm in any great hurry to do, but like any sensible middle-aged man, I got to see the doctor once a year, and if he said, don't go booking any holidays after November, I'd be able, I think, to provide readers with a conclusion or an answer to the questions that have been posed in the series that I think they will be happy with.
Years ago, I heard that Ruth Rendell had written a posthumous Wexford book to be published after she died. And when Ruth died, I asked her editor if that was true, and she said no, which was a great sadness to me.
I'm going to ask one more question, if you don't mind, and this is picking up on, Ian, something that you were reported as saying in The Scotsman, but something that kind of struck me from both your most recent books. I mean, certainly over the past year in America, the issue about policing and the extent to which lawmakers become lawbreakers has become fairly obvious, and that now with what happened in London last month. That issue about the police and whether or not the police are in, I think you described them, they're no longer knights in shining armor. Has it become more difficult to write a crime novel with a detective when perhaps trust in the police? And what struck me, I mean, John, in The Dirty South, you have the character of Jarrell Cade, who's a thoroughly unpleasant individual, despite the fact that he's a police officer. And in yours, the assistant chief constable is kind of, there's a storyline involving her with Malcolm Fox and Ger Cavanagh. I was just wondering, to what extent do you think that might impact on crime writing in general, but more specifically in your own writing?
Well, I mean, I do think that fewer people seem to be writing police procedurals than used to be the case. It's no longer the norm in the UK. It used to be the norm that crime fiction was about police detectives. So, you know, maybe more writers don't have to think about this, and I'm lucky that Rebus is retired, so I don't have to think about it too much. Yeah, I mean, it's happened in Scotland. It happened in Kirkcaldy, near where I grew up in Fife, that a black man ended up dead after being subdued on the ground by some police officers. And that's been investigated. So I think readers are going to have to come to terms with it. I think writers came to terms with it a while ago, that there are no knights in shining armor of either sex, that cops are as human and fallible as anybody else, but the kind of job they do means they're not allowed to be human and fallible. And sometimes one small mistake can have huge ramifications.
And John, what about, I mean, Parker, I suppose, in a way, you've got a kind of get-out clause in that he's not a police officer as such anymore, but in terms of the ideas of the gap between the law and justice, that's always been there in the Parker books, anyway.
They do, and even a book like The Dirty South, although it's set in the past, in the same way that science fiction is never about the future, books set in the past are never really about the past either. It's not even the past, as Faulkner said. So, that was a book very much written in the shadow of what was happening in the US, of Black Lives Matter. And it was a way, I think, of approaching it from a slightly different angle, and one that was maybe not quite so on the nose, because there's nothing worse than hearing the sound of the writer pulling up his orange crate and clearing his throat and holding onto his lapel as he prepares to declaim about social ills. I think one of the things you have to do, you have to have a degree of subtlety to it. And sometimes writing about the past or the future allows you to do that.
Look, gents, thank you so much for your time.
Very well chaired, Brian, may we say, or brain, if we can call it that.
It was one of the easiest things I've ever had a chair. I just sat back and watched and enjoyed it and drank a glass of warm white wine, just as book festivals always are. But look, thank you very much to both of you. Thank you to Luca and Steve, and congratulations, Luca and Steve, for organising Lockdown 2. Even if we never have another lockdown, I do hope we have another one of these festivals. It has been an absolute pleasure. Gentlemen, thank you. And to all of you.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you. Take care.